So you're telling me there are underwater icicles in the ocean where the water is, liquid?
Not just underwater icicles, Marcus. Underwater icicles that actively hunt and kill.
I'm sorry, did you just say these icicles hunt?
Well, hunt might be a strong word. Let's say they descend with murderous intent.
Elena, icicles don't have intent. They're frozen water.
These ones have been called the icy finger of death. Starfish flee from them. Sea urchins try to escape, and when the Brinicle touches the seafloor, it spreads across the ocean bottom like something out of a horror movie, freezing every living creature in its path.
Okay, now you're just messing with me.
I have BBC footage.
Show me.
Welcome to Brinicles, the underwater icicles that freeze everything they touch. I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez.
And I'm Marcus Chen, here to find out if nature has finally decided to just terrify us for fun. Today, we're exploring one of the most bizarre, deadly, and frankly unbelievable phenomena on our planet, and possibly beyond it.
Because here's the kicker. These things might have helped create life on Earth billions of years ago, and they might be doing the same thing right now on Jupiter's moon Europa.
From finger of death to origin of life, that's quite the range.
Nature contains multitudes.
Apparently terrifying, murderous multitudes. Let's dive in.
All right, Elena. Start from the beginning. What exactly is a brinicle?
A brinicle, that's a portmanteau of brine and icicle, is a hollow tube of ice that forms beneath sea ice in polar regions. It grows downward from the underside of the ice, reaching toward the seafloor like a frozen stalactite.
So it's just an underwater icicle. What's the big deal?
The big deal is how it forms and what it does. Unlike a regular icicle, which is just frozen rainwater dripping from your roof, a brinicle is essentially a delivery system for supercooled, super saline water that's colder than ice itself.
Wait, colder than ice? How is that possible?
Salt. When you add salt to water, you lower its freezing point. That's why we salt roads in winter. It keeps ice from freezing at temperatures where pure water would freeze. Seawater freezes at around minus 1.9 degrees Celsius, but when that water starts to freeze and expels its salt, the remaining brine can stay liquid at temperatures as low as minus 20 to minus 23 degrees Celsius.
Okay, so we have super salty, super cold water that refuses to freeze. Then what?
Then physics takes over. This brine is denser than regular seawater because of all that salt, so it sinks. As it descends through the ocean, it comes into contact with warmer, less salty water that can freeze at higher temperatures.
And when the super cold brine touches that warmer water,
it freezes instantly. A sheath of ice forms around the descending plume of brine, creating a hollow tube. And because the brine keeps flowing downward, the tube keeps growing. It's like an icicle turned inside out. Instead of cold air freezing liquid water in layers, cold liquid is freezing the surrounding water, creating a tube that grows downward.
how fast are we talking?
Brinicles can grow at rates of up to 30 centimeters per hour under the right conditions. The BBC filmed one forming over about 5 to 6 hours, but the growth can be visible to the naked eye. You can actually watch these things extend downward in real time.
That's genuinely unsettling. How big do they get?
They can reach several meters in length. The limiting factors are the depth of the water, the supply of brine from above, the water temperature, and whether ocean currents knock them over. They're surprisingly fragile. The walls are thin and can shatter at the slightest touch.
So we have fragile death tubes made of ice growing underwater. Who discovered these things?
The first scattered evidence dates back to 1962, but the phenomenon wasn't really understood until oceanographers Paul Dayton and Celie Martin observed and described them in the early 1970s. Martin proposed the generally accepted model of their formation in 1974, and he even managed to grow simulated brinicles in his Seattle laboratory.
Wait, Seattle? You can make these things in a lab?
With the right equipment, yes. You need extremely cold brine, a tank of seawater at the right temperature, and controlled conditions. Martin's work was foundational, but for decades, almost nobody outside the scientific community had heard of Brinicles.
So what changed?
The BBC's Frozen Planet series in 2011, that's when producer Catherine Jeffs and cameraman Hugh Miller and Doug Anderson captured the first ever footage of a Brinicle forming in the wild. The video went viral, and suddenly everyone was talking about the icy finger of death.
I remember that footage. It looked like CGI. The icicle just reaches down and touches the seafloor, and then ice spreads across the bottom like something from a disaster movie.
That spreading ice is called anchor ice. When the Brinicle reaches the seafloor, the cold brine pools and flows outward, freezing the bottom sediment and anything living on it. Starfish, sea urchins, marine worms, anything too slow to escape gets frozen in place.
Which brings us to the Finger of Death nickname.
Coined by the BBC team, and honestly, it's accurate. For the creatures of the bottom feeding that can't move quickly, a Brinicle touching down is essentially a death sentence.
Okay, but I have to ask, how rare is this? Are Brinicles forming all over the polar oceans constantly? Or is this a once-in-a-blue-moon event?
They're not common, but they're not extraordinarily rare either. The conditions have to be just right. You need calm seas, because strong currents will break the fragile ice tube. You need a significant temperature differential between the air above the ice and the water below. Typically, air temperatures well below minus 20 degrees Celsius, while the water is at minus 1.9 degrees Celsius. And you need the brine channels in the sea ice to concentrate in a localized area.
So, winter in the Arctic and Antarctic.
Exactly. They've been documented in both polar regions, but the most famous observations come from McMurdo Sound in Antarctica, near the Ross Archipelago. That's where the BBC filmed their footage, near Little Razorback Island.
Let's talk about that filming, because it sounds like it was an absolute nightmare to accomplish.
It really was. Hugh Miller and Doug Anderson were diving in water at minus 2 degrees Celsius, the coldest water in the world that isn't frozen solid. They had to use specialized equipment to extend their dive times because the cold was so extreme. Miller described emerging from hour-long dives in visible pain from the cold.
And they had to set up time-lapse equipment underwater.
Multiple cameras, multiple tripods, lighting stands, control boxes, cables, all of it heavy enough to stay on the seafloor and not get knocked around. They had to shuttle everything through narrow tunnels in the ice to reach a natural gallery where they'd spotted Brinicle formation.
And then the seals showed up.
The Weddell seals in the area had absolutely no respect for scientific equipment. Miller said, "The first time I did a time-lapse at the spot, a seal knocked it over. They kept barging through, breaking fledgling Brinicle structures and bumping into cameras. So not only are you freezing to death and hauling heavy equipment through ice tunnels, but the local wildlife is actively sabotaging your shoot."
Welcome to polar filmmaking. But they persevered, and the footage they captured was groundbreaking. It was the first time anyone had ever filmed a Brinicle forming from start to finish, and specifically the first time anyone captured a Brinicle reaching the seafloor, and that horrifying moment when the ice web spreads across the bottom.
The moment it earned its name. Sir David Attenborough narrated it beautifully. For the creatures of the seabed, it's a stealthy finger of death.
You know, I've been a science journalist for years, and I pride myself on knowing about obscure phenomena. But Brinicles were completely off my radar until about 5 years ago. Why is that?
Partly because they're so hard to observe. They only form in extremely inhospitable environments, they're fragile and short-lived, and until we had the technology to film them, most people had to take scientists' word for it. The 2011 footage changed everything, because suddenly there was visual proof.
Seeing is believing.
Especially when what you're seeing looks like something from science fiction. I think a lot of people watched that footage and thought there's no way this is real.
I definitely had that reaction. All right, we've established what Brinicles are and how they were discovered. All right, Elena, start from the beginning. What exactly is a Brinicle?
A brinicle, that's a portmanteau of brine and icicle, is a hollow tube of ice that forms beneath sea ice in polar regions.
Elena, you promised me a physics lesson. Explain to me how water can be colder than ice.
Okay, first we need to understand what happens when seawater freezes, because it's completely different from what happens when fresh water freezes.
Fresh water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. Everyone knows that.
Right, but that's pure water with no dissolved salts. When you freeze pure water, you get solid ice. Simple. But seawater contains about 3.5% dissolved salts, mostly sodium chloride, but also magnesium, calcium, potassium, and other ions. When seawater starts to freeze, something interesting happens.
The salt gets excluded?
Exactly. As ice crystals form, they organize into a crystal lattice structure, and that lattice doesn't have room for the salt ions. So the salt gets pushed out of the ice and into the surrounding water. The result is that sea ice is relatively fresh, much less salty than the water it came from, while the remaining liquid water becomes more and more concentrated with salt.
So you end up with fresh ice and super salty water.
Right. And here's where freezing point depression comes in. The more salt you dissolve in water, the lower its freezing point becomes. Regular seawater at 3.5% salinity freezes at about minus 1.9 degrees Celsius. But if you concentrate that salt, say to 10% or 15%, the freezing point drops further. At very high salinities, the brine can remain liquid at minus 20 degrees or colder.
So the brine is still liquid, even though it's colder than the temperature at which regular water freezes.
Exactly. And this is the critical point. The brine's temperature can be colder than the freezing point of regular seawater. So when the super cold, super salty brine encounters regular seawater, it acts like a freezing agent, sucking heat out of the surrounding water and causing it to freeze instantly.
It's like having liquid nitrogen flowing through the ocean.
Not quite that extreme, but the principle is similar. The brine is a supercooled liquid that causes rapid freezing of any less salty water it contacts.
Okay, so we have this super cold, super salty brine. How does it get from the ice into the ocean?
Through brine channels. When sea ice forms, it's not a solid, homogeneous block like ice from your freezer. It's more like Dr. Mark Brandon from the Open University described it as a seawater-soaked sponge with a tiny network of brine channels within it.
A sponge made of ice?
Exactly. The ice has this porous structure with tiny tunnels running through it, and those tunnels are filled with concentrated brine. As the ice continues to grow and the air above gets colder, more ice forms, more salt gets expelled, and the brine becomes more concentrated and colder.
And it's heavier, too.
Much heavier. The brine's density increases with its salt concentration, so it sinks through the brine channels, following gravity downward. Eventually, it reaches the bottom of the ice layer and starts leaking into the open ocean.
And that's when the Brinicle starts to form.
Right. If the brine channels are evenly distributed throughout the ice, the brine just disperses and mixes with the ocean water below. But if the channels concentrate in one area, maybe because of a crack in the ice or an irregularity in its structure, you get a focused stream of brine flowing downward.
A plume.
Exactly. Scientists compare it to how hot air rises from a fire, except this is cold, dense water sinking. As the plume descends, the super cold brine freezes the seawater around it, and a tube of ice begins to form.
Tube? Why not just a solid pillar of ice?
Because the brine itself can't freeze. It's too salty and too cold. So you get this hollow structure with the brine flowing through the center and ice forming around the outside. The Brinicle is essentially an insulating sheath around a river of super-cooled brine.
Like a frozen straw.
A frozen straw of death, yes. And as long as the brine keeps flowing, the Brinicle keeps growing. The ice at the bottom keeps forming, the tube extends downward, and the whole structure reaches towards the seafloor.
You mentioned the Brinicle is fragile. Why is that?
The walls are thin, just a layer of ice that formed when the surrounding water froze. There's no structural strength there. Strong currents can snap them off, swimming animals can break them. Even the weight of the growing Brinicle can cause it to collapse if the brain flow slows down.
So they need calm conditions.
Very calm. That's why they're most commonly observed in sheltered areas like McMurdo Sound, where the ice protects the water from strong currents and wave action.
Let's talk numbers. How cold does it actually get inside one of these things?
Research from the White Sea in Russia, published in 2014, measured brine temperatures inside forming Brinicles at air temperatures of -1 degree Celsius. The brine's salinity was around 30 to 35 practical salinity units, while the surrounding seawater was at 28 PSU. When the air temperature dropped to -12 degrees Celsius, the brine's salinity jumped to between 120 and 156 PSU.
For context, how salty is normal seawater?
About 35 PSU, so we're talking about brine that's 3 to 4 times saltier than seawater.
And correspondingly colder.
Yes, at those concentrations, the brine could be at -10 to -15 degrees Celsius or even colder while remaining liquid.
That's genuinely remarkable. Okay, so the Brinicle grows downward, the brine keeps flowing. What happens when it hits the seafloor?
That's when it gets really interesting and really deadly. When the Brinicle reaches the bottom, the dense brine doesn't stop flowing. It pools on the seafloor and begins to spread outward, following the topography.
And because it's still super cold,
it keeps freezing everything it touches. Water in the sediment, water around rocks, water inside the bodies of any creatures unlucky enough to be in the way. Ice crystals spread across the ocean floor like a web, creating what's called anchor ice.
And that's what we see in the BBC footage, that spreading wave of ice.
Exactly. In some cases, the brine can pool in depressions on the seafloor, creating what are ominously called black pools of death.
I'm sorry, did you say black pools of death?
I did. They're pools of concentrated brine that are so dense and so cold that any creature wandering into them would die almost immediately. They're called black because the high salinity gives them a different refractive index than regular seawater, making them appear dark or distinct from their surroundings.
So not only do you have icicles descending from above, but there are literal death pools waiting on the seafloor.
The Antarctic Ocean is not a forgiving environment.
Clearly. Let's talk about the comparison to chemical gardens, because I've seen that mentioned in several papers.
That's a fascinating parallel. Chemical gardens are a classic chemistry demonstration. You drop metal salt crystals into a silicate solution, and tubular structures grow upward from the crystals. The tubes form because of semi-permeable membranes that develop at the interface between the salt and the solution.
And Brinicles are similar.
They're essentially inverse chemical gardens. Instead of tubes growing upward from a solid, you have tubes growing downward from a liquid source. But the underlying physics, osmotic pressure, membrane formation, concentration gradients, are remarkably similar.
A 2013 paper called them a case of inverse chemical gardens.
Right, that's the Cartwright paper. Julian Cartwright from the University of Granada and his colleagues analyzed the formation, chemistry, and structure of Brinicles and showed that they behave like chemical gardens turned upside down. This isn't just academic interest. It has profound implications for understanding self-organizing systems and potentially the origin of life.
You keep teasing that origin of life connection. We're gonna get there, I promise.
We are, but first, we need to talk about what Brinicles actually do to living creatures, because it's as dramatic as you'd expect.
The finger of death awaits.
All right, Elena, let's talk about the death part. What actually happens to marine life when a Brinicle forms?
So picture the Antarctic seafloor during winter. You've got a community of bottom-dwelling organisms, sea urchins, starfish, marine worms, sea anemones, various invertebrates. These creatures have adapted to survive in water that's essentially at the freezing point year-round. They're tough.
But not tough enough for Brinicle.
Nothing down there is tough enough for a Brinicle. When that tube of supercooled brine starts descending, the creatures on the seafloor can actually sense it coming. In the BBC footage, you can see starfish and urchins beginning to move away from the area before the Brinicle even touches down.
Wait, they can sense it? How?
Probably through temperature and salinity changes in the water. As the brine plume descends, it creates local disturbances. Creatures with sensitive chemoreceptors or temperature sensors would detect the approaching cold front.
So they try to flee.
They try, but here's the problem. Starfish and sea urchins aren't exactly fast movers. They might travel a few centimeters per minute at best. And when a Brinicle touches down and the ice web starts spreading, it can move faster than they can flee.
It outruns them.
In the footage, you can literally watch the ice spreading across the seafloor, overtaking fleeing starfish. The creatures get encased in ice, frozen solid where they crawl. The BBC described the resulting seafloor as littered with the skeletons of marine life.
Skeletons? The ice actually kills them that quickly?
The combination of extreme cold and high salinity is immediately lethal. When the super cold brine contacts their bodies, ice crystals form in their tissues almost instantaneously. Their body fluids freeze, cell membranes rupture, and they die within seconds.
It's like being flash frozen.
Exactly like that. And because the ice spreads across the seafloor, whole communities of organisms can be wiped out in a single event. Where there was a thriving community of invertebrates, there's suddenly a frozen graveyard.
How far can the ice spread?
That depends on the volume of brine, the temperature differential, and the topography. In some cases, the anchor ice can spread several meters from the Brinicle's base. One source mentioned a radius of about 3.5 meters, but it varies.
And those black pools of death you mentioned, how long do they persist?
They're relatively transient. Remember, the brine supply eventually stops. It depends on the winter air temperature and the ongoing freeze of the sea ice above. When the brine flow ceases, the pools slowly diffuse and mix with the surrounding seawater. But while they exist, they're death traps for any creature that wanders into them.
So, unlike, say, a brine pool in the Gulf of Mexico that can persist for years, these are temporary features.
Right. Brine pools in the Gulf of Mexico form through different mechanisms. Salt tectonics, where ancient salt deposits are exposed on the seafloor. Those can be stable for very long periods. Brinicle-created brine pools are seasonal phenomena tied to winter conditions.
Let me ask the obvious question. Could a Brinicle harm a human diver?
Theoretically, but practically no. The Brinicles form in water that's already at -2 degrees Celsius. Any human diving in those conditions is wearing specialized dry suits and cold water gear. The brief exposure to slightly colder brine wouldn't be significantly more dangerous than the baseline environment, which is already trying to kill you.
So the danger to humans is more about diving in Antarctic winter than about the Brinicles specifically.
Exactly. Andrew Thurber, a researcher at Oregon State University who has dived among Brinicles, described them as upside-down cacti. He noted the pools are deadly to other animals but are not known to harm humans. That said, he also advised that you shouldn't go looking for Brinicles to test that theory.
Sound advice. Let's talk about the ecological impact. Is this a significant factor in Antarctic marine ecosystems, or is it more of a curiosity?
That's a great question, and honestly, we're still learning. Brinicles are relatively rare events, and the populations of seafloor invertebrates in Antarctica are robust enough to recover from localized die-offs. So in the grand scheme of Antarctic ecology, Brinicles probably play a minor direct role.
But
they're part of a broader system of ice-ocean interactions that's crucial to Antarctic ecology. The brine rejection process, where salt is expelled from forming sea ice, drives ocean circulation patterns. Dense, salty water sinking from the surface helps power the global thermohaline circulation.
The conveyor belt that moves heat around the planet.
Right. Brinicles are just the most dramatic, visible manifestation of this process. They're like the tip of the iceberg, if you'll forgive the pun, a spectacular phenomenon that points to much larger processes happening throughout the polar oceans.
So studying Brinicles helps us understand ocean dynamics.
And more than that, the chemistry of brinicles, the concentration of salts, minerals, the extreme temperature gradients, the unique microenvironments they create, turns out to be fascinating from a biochemical perspective.
This is where we get to the origin of life connection.
Almost. First, let me tell you about what's actually in the brine, because it's not just sodium chloride.
I'm listening.
So, when seawater freezes and the salt gets concentrated, you also concentrate other dissolved substances, minerals, organic molecules, trace elements. The brine inside a brinicle can be rich in compounds that are essential for chemistry and potentially for biology.
Like what?
Calcium, magnesium, potassium, sulfates. There's also dissolved organic matter, lipids, proteins, carbohydrates that were in the seawater. As the brine concentrates, these compounds can reach much higher concentrations than they ever would in open ocean water.
Creating a kind of natural reactor.
Exactly. And the brinicle structure itself, that hollow tube with brine flowing through, creates gradients. Temperature gradients, concentration gradients, pH gradients. Gradients are important in chemistry because they can drive reactions.
Energy differentials.
Right. The American Chemical Association journal Langmuir published a study comparing brinicle formation to hydrothermal vents, except in reverse. Hydrothermal vents spew hot, mineral-rich water into cold seawater. Brinicles send cold, mineral-rich water into slightly warmer seawater. Both create chemical gradients that can drive interesting chemistry.
And hydrothermal vents are one of the leading candidates for where life originated on Earth.
Exactly. Which raises an intriguing question. Could brinicles have played a similar role?
I think we're ready for the next part.
All right, Elena, you've been hinting at this for the entire episode. How do underwater icicles of death connect to the origin of life?
Let me set the stage. One of the biggest questions in science is how life began on Earth, roughly 4 billion years ago. We know that somehow, simple chemistry gave rise to complex biochemistry, non-living molecules organized into self-replicating, metabolizing systems that we'd recognize as alive.
The transition from chemistry to biology.
Right. And one of the key challenges is understanding what environment could have supported that transition. You need a place with energy sources, chemical building blocks, and structures that can concentrate and organize molecules.
And hydrothermal vents are the poster child for this.
They are. Deep-sea hydrothermal vents provide heat energy, mineral-rich fluids, and chimney-like structures that create gradients and microenvironments. A lot of origin of life research focuses on these hot start scenarios.
But there's also a cold start hypothesis?
Exactly, and this is where brinicles come in. Some scientists have proposed that life might have originated not in hot, volcanic environments, but in cold, icy ones. And brinicles, or structures like them, could have been key players.
Why would cold be better than hot?
Several reasons. First, cold slows down chemical reactions, which sounds bad, but it can actually help preserve fragile molecules that would break down quickly at high temperatures. RNA, for instance, which many scientists think was crucial for early life, is more stable in cold conditions.
So you can accumulate complex molecules without them falling apart.
Right. Second, ice can actually concentrate molecules. When water freezes, it excludes dissolved substances, just like it excludes salt. So if you have a mixture of organic molecules in water, and that water starts to freeze, those molecules get concentrated in the remaining liquid, the brine.
Creating a natural concentration mechanism.
Exactly. Researchers have shown that the concentration of organic molecules in brine channels can be orders of magnitude higher than in open water. That's important because chemical reactions, especially polymerization reactions that build up complex molecules from simple ones, are much more likely when the reactants are concentrated.
So brinicles create conditions where complex chemistry is more likely to happen.
Right. And third, the structure of brinicles and brine channels create compartments. Compartmentalization is crucial for life. Every cell is essentially a compartment, separated from its environment by a membrane. Brine channels in ice can act as natural compartments, concentrating molecules and keeping them together.
Like protocells.
Some researchers call them exactly that. The 2013 Cartwright paper suggested that brine channels could function as chemical gardens, where organic molecules grow and organize. And Brinicles, as the most dramatic expression of brine dynamics, exemplify this process.
But we're talking about conditions that exist today in Antarctica. Were there Brinicles 4 billion years ago?
The early Earth went through periods of extensive glaciation, including potentially a snowball Earth episode, where ice covered most of the planet. If those conditions existed, Brinicle-like structures could have formed in ancient oceans.
And they would have created the same chemical gradients and concentration effects.
Exactly. A paper in MIT Technology Review put it beautifully. As Brinicles play an important role in the dynamics of brine transport through sea ice, they might also play a role in this scenario of a cold origin of life, just as hydrothermal vents do in the hot environment theories.
So we have two competing, or maybe complementary, hypotheses for the origin of life: hot vents and cold Brinicles.
And here's the thing, they might not be mutually exclusive. Some researchers suggest that life might have originated in multiple environments simultaneously, or that different stages of life's emergence might have benefited from different conditions. Cold might be good for building and preserving complex molecules. Heat might be good for powering metabolism.
What about actual experimental evidence? Has anyone shown that Brinicle-like conditions can produce biological molecules?
Yes, researchers have demonstrated that ice formation can concentrate nucleotides, the building blocks of RNA and DNA, enough for polymerization reactions to occur. There's even evidence that RNA replication can happen in ice, using the brine channels as reaction vessels.
RNA replication in ice. That's wild.
A paper in Nature Communications showed that ice can act as a protocellular medium for RNA replication. The cold preserves the molecules, the concentration effect brings them together, and the brine channels provide compartments where reactions can occur.
Okay, I'm convinced that this is plausible for Earth, but you mentioned earlier that Brinicles might be relevant to Europa?
This is where it gets really exciting. Europa, Jupiter's moon, has a global liquid water ocean beneath a shell of ice, and the conditions there are potentially perfect for Brinicle formation.
Because you've got ice on top of a salty ocean.
Right. The Europa Ocean is probably salty. We've detected salts on Europa's surface that likely come from the ocean below, and the ice shell is being constantly churned by tidal forces from Jupiter's gravity. You'd expect brine rejection, brine channels, and potentially structures very similar to Earth's Brinicles.
Underwater icicles of death on an alien moon.
Or underwater icicles of life, depending on how you look at it. A 2019 paper in the journal Astrobiology by Stephen Vance and colleagues at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab specifically examined self-assembling ice membranes on Europa and argued that Brinicles could be important for chemistry and potentially life in Europa's ocean.
What did they find?
They used a model called freeze-chem to calculate how salts would behave in Europa's ice and ocean. They found that sulfate, an important compound for biology, would likely fractionate out of accreting ice, meaning it would concentrate in the brine. This creates the chemical gradients that could drive interesting chemistry.
And they specifically suggested Brinicles as potential habitats.
Yes, the paper states, we suggest that, like hydrothermal vents on Earth, Brinicles in icy water worlds constitute ideal places where ecosystems of organisms might be found.
That's a remarkable statement. We're talking about Brinicles as potential alien habitats.
And not just Europa. Enceladus, Saturn's moon, also has a subsurface ocean and active plumes venting water into space. Ganymede and Callisto, two other moons of Jupiter, likely have oceans too. Any icy world with a liquid ocean could potentially have Brinicle-like structures.
So when we're looking for life in the solar system, we should be thinking about ice as much as water.
Exactly. The interface between ice and liquid, the place where Brinicles form, might be one of the most important environments for astrobiology.
This completely changes how I think about these phenomena. They're not just dramatic weather events, they're potential crucibles for life.
And that's why the scientific interest in Brinicles has exploded in recent years. They're not just curiosities anymore, they're windows into fundamental questions about chemistry, physics, and biology.
we need to talk more about Europa. We're talking about brinicles, underwater icicles that kill things here on Earth, but might create life on other worlds. Elena, let's focus on Europa. What do we actually know about conditions there?
Europa is one of Jupiter's 4 large Galilean moons, about the size of our moon, but very different. Its surface is ice, roughly 15 to 25 kilometers thick, covering a global ocean of liquid water that's probably about 60 to 150 kilometers deep.
That's a lot of water.
Europa's ocean likely contains 2 to 3 times more water than all of Earth's oceans combined. And it's been liquid for potentially billions of years, kept warm by tidal heating from Jupiter's gravitational pull.
So you have liquid water, you have time, and you potentially have energy. The ingredients for life.
Right, and the surface features of Europa, the cracks, ridges, and chaotic terrain, suggest that the ice shell is dynamic. Material from the ocean reaches the surface, and surface material likely sinks back down. There's exchange between the ice and the ocean.
Which is exactly the kind of environment where brinicles would form.
Exactly. When Europa's ice shell grows, which it probably does continuously as heat escapes from the ocean, salt and other dissolved substances would be expelled, creating brine. That brine would be denser than the surrounding water and would sink, just like on Earth.
So Europa could have brinicles extending downward from the underside of its ice shell.
Potentially kilometers long, given the thickness of the ice, and because Europa's gravity is lower than Earth's, about 13%, the brinicles might be more stable, less likely to break under their own weight.
Giant alien brinicles. What would the brine composition be like?
That's uncertain, but we have clues. Spectrometers on spacecraft like Galileo detected what appeared to be salts on Europa's surface, probably magnesium sulfate and sodium chloride, among others. If those salts come from the ocean, then Europa's brine would have similar components to Earth's, but in different proportions.
And the Vance paper suggested sulfate would concentrate in the brine.
Right. Sulfate is particularly interesting because it's biologically relevant. On Earth, many microorganisms use sulfate in their metabolism, sulfate-reducing bacteria, for instance. If Europa's brinicles concentrate sulfate, they could provide an energy source for similar organisms.
So you're not just talking about brinicles as passive environments. You're suggesting they could actively support metabolizing life.
That's the hypothesis. Brinicles would create chemical gradients, temperature differences, concentration differences, redox gradients. Those gradients represent energy that biological systems could potentially harvest.
Like a battery.
Exactly. And on Earth, we know that life thrives at interfaces, the boundary between different environments. The underside of ice, where brinicles form, is exactly this kind of interface.
What about the extreme conditions? Earth brinicles involve temperatures of minus 20 degrees Celsius or colder. What about Europa?
Europa's ice surface is extremely cold, around minus 160 degrees Celsius, but the ocean below is probably near the freezing point of its saline water, maybe around minus 4 to minus 10 degrees Celsius, depending on salinity. That's not far from Earth's polar oceans.
So the ocean itself is survivable by Earth standards.
Absolutely. We have microorganisms on Earth, halophiles, psychophiles, that thrive in cold, salty conditions. The brine channels in Antarctic sea ice harbor microbial communities. There's no obvious reason similar organisms couldn't exist in Europa's ocean.
Have we detected any signs of life on Europa?
Not yet, but we've barely looked. The Galileo mission in the 1990s and early 2000s gave us most of what we know about Europa, but it wasn't designed to look for life. The Europa Clipper mission, launched by NASA, will conduct detailed flybys starting in 2030.
What will Clipper look for?
It'll characterize the ice shell, map the surface composition, measure the magnetic field to confirm the ocean's existence and properties, and look for plumes of water venting from the surface. If Europa has active plumes like Enceladus, we might be able to sample ocean material without even landing.
And that material could contain biosignatures?
Potentially. Organic molecules, certain mineral compositions, isotopic ratios. There are various signs that could indicate biological activity. But even if Clipper finds something suggestive, we'd probably need a lander to be sure.
Let's talk about Enceladus for a moment, since you mentioned it.
How does it compare to Europa?
Enceladus is much smaller than Europa, only about 500 kilometers in diameter, compared to Europa's 3,100 kilometers. But it punches above its weight astrobiologically because of its active plumes.
The geysers at the South Pole.
Right. Enceladus vents water ice and vapor into space through cracks in its southern ice shell. The Cassini mission flew through these plumes and detected water, salts, organic molecules, and molecular hydrogen, which is exciting because hydrogen can be an energy source for certain microorganisms.
So Enceladus is basically handing us samples of its ocean.
Exactly. You don't need to drill through kilometers of ice, you just fly through the plumes and collect what comes out. If there's life in Enceladus's ocean, it might literally be spraying evidence into space.
And Brinicles could form there too.
The conditions seem right. Enceladus has a salty ocean beneath an ice shell, and the plumes suggest active ice dynamics. Brinicle-like structures could form at the ice-ocean interface.
What about other icy worlds? You mentioned Ganymede and Callisto.
Both are thought to have subsurface oceans, though possibly sandwiched between layers of ice rather than in contact with a rocky core like Europa and Enceladus. That might limit the chemical complexity, but Brinicle formation could still occur.
And beyond our solar system?
Exoplanets with icy surfaces and subsurface oceans are plausible. If a planet orbits far from its star but has internal heat sources, from tidal forces or radioactive decay, it could maintain liquid water beneath ice. The conditions for Brinicle formation might be common throughout the galaxy.
So when we're searching for life in the universe, Brinicles, or the chemistry they represent, might be a universal phenomenon.
That's the implication. Life might not require warm, Earth-like conditions at all. Cold, icy worlds could be just as habitable, maybe more habitable if the ice-ocean interface provides the right chemical environment.
That would radically expand the number of potentially habitable worlds.
By orders of magnitude, there are probably more icy moons with subsurface oceans in our galaxy than Earth-like planets in the habitable zone of their stars. If those oceans can support life, the universe might be teeming with it.
Hidden beneath ice, where we never thought to look.
Until now, Brinicle research has helped open our eyes to these possibilities.
We've covered an incredible amount of ground, from Antarctic sea ice to Jovian moons. As we wrap up, I want to bring it back to Earth. What's next for Brinicle research?
Several directions. First, there's ongoing work to better understand the physics of Brinicle formation. A 2023 paper from researchers in Columbia and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory developed the first numerical model for Brinicle formation, letting scientists simulate how these structures grow under different conditions.
Why is modeling important?
Because we can't easily observe Brinicles in the wild. They form in some of the most inhospitable places on Earth, and they're fragile and short-lived. Computer models let us explore parameter space, different temperatures, salinities, ice conditions, and make predictions about where and when Brinicles should form.
That would help identify the best locations for field research.
Right, and it helps us understand what Brinicle formation might look like on Europa or Enceladus, where we can't observe directly, but can make educated guesses about conditions.
What about the origin of life research?
That's an active area. Researchers are conducting laboratory experiments to see what kinds of chemistry can occur in simulated Brinicle environments. Can RNA form? Can membranes self-assemble? Can metabolic-like reactions occur? Each positive result strengthens the case that cold environments could have supported life's emergence.
And what about climate implications? As the Arctic and Antarctic warm, how will that affect Brinicle formation?
That's a concern. Brinicles require extreme cold, air temperatures well below minus 20 degrees Celsius to form the supercold brine. As polar regions warm, the conditions for Brinicle formation may become less common. Sea ice is already declining in extent and thickness.
So we might lose Brinicles before we fully understand them.
It's possible. The 2011 BBC footage might become even more valuable as a historical document of phenomena that become increasingly rare.
That's sobering. Any final thoughts on why people should care about Brinicles?
I think Brinicles represent something important about science and nature. Here's this phenomenon that sounds made up, Underwater icicles that grow downward, freeze everything they touch, might have helped create life, and could exist on alien moons. It sounds like fantasy.
But it's real.
Completely real. And we only documented it visually for the first time in 2011. Brinicles remind us that our planet still holds surprises, that there are processes happening in remote places that challenge our understanding and expand our sense of what's possible.
And they connect Earth to the cosmos.
That's the beautiful part. Studying an ice formation in Antarctica helps us think about life on Europa. The same physics, the same chemistry, potentially the same biology. We're not separate from the universe, we're embedded in it. The processes that happen here are universal.
The icy finger of death is also the icy finger of life.
I couldn't have said it better.
Elena, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for walking us through one of nature's most bizarre and wonderful phenomena.
Thank you, Marcus. It's not often I get to talk about murderous ice tubes and the origin of life in the same conversation. And if you're ever in Antarctica and see a seal knock over some camera equipment, now you know why.
Until next time, stay curious and maybe stay away from the seafloor.
Especially if you're a starfish.
I'm Marcus Chen.
And I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez.
Thanks for listening.